Walk right through, everyone. It's part of the tour.
That's what the HOA president sang out as she waved 60 Saturday morning strangers straight into my asparagus rows, like she owned the land beneath their sneakers. I stood on my porch with coffee in hand, watching grown adults snap tender green spears off my crowns for selfies, while she beamed like the grand marshal of a parade. She wasn't enforcing a rule. She wasn't protecting the community. She told every guest the path was a shared public easement, which was a phrase she invented the same week she printed her glossy little brochures. What she didn't know was that every one of my 32 asparagus beds had been wired for motion-activated trail cameras for the past 11 months, and every frame was stamped, backed up, and time-coded to the second. So I didn't shout, I didn't chase. I just lifted my phone, hit record, and let her keep performing. Tell me below, would you have stopped her, or let 60 witnesses film their own confession? And where are you watching from tonight? My name is Daniel Roper, and 3 years ago I buried my wife on a hillside that looks out over the same asparagus field my father planted in 1978. Sarah was 39 when pancreatic cancer took her. She left behind me and a wiry 12-year-old boy named Eli, who still talks to her photograph every morning over his cereal. We live in Oceana County, Michigan, about 8 miles inland from Lake Michigan, right in the beating heart of what locals proudly call the asparagus capital of the world. The farm is 18 acres of sandy loam soil that my grandfather bought for $2,200 the year Eisenhower was president. And the main asparagus field sits like a long green ladder running east to west, 32 raised beds with mulched walking lanes between each pair. Before Sarah got sick, I had a good engineering job designing stormwater systems for municipalities across the Lower Peninsula. After she died, I left it, came home, let the cubicle rot, and the spreadsheets gather dust. I wanted Eli to grow up watching something come out of the ground, instead of something disappear from a hospital bed. The trouble started the spring a developer from Grand Rapids carved 96 half-acre lots out of an old cherry orchard directly across the county road from my farm. They called the subdivision Harbor View Estates, even though you couldn't see the harbor from any house in it unless you stood on the roof with binoculars. The homes went up fast, with those tall cathedral windows and those lawns so green they looked painted. 6 months after the first closing, the new residents voted in an HOA, and the woman they elected president was a transplant from the suburbs outside Chicago, named Margaret Whitlock, a woman who introduced herself to me one Tuesday morning while I was mulching row 17. She stood at the edge of the field in a white linen blouse and white sneakers, squinting at my beds like they offended her personally, and she said, "I'm going to need you to clean up this eyesore before our spring tour." I wiped my hands on my jeans and smiled the way my father taught me to smile at strangers who hadn't earned anything yet. I said, "Ma'am, this field's been here since 1978. The tour's going to have to work around it." She laughed without moving her eyes, which is how you can tell somebody isn't actually laughing. Then she said very slowly, as if I were a foreign exchange student trying my best, "Oh, honey, the tour is going through it." That was our first and last conversation that week. Within 7 days, she had printed a full-color brochure titled Harborview Estates Community Garden Walk, your guided tour through our farm-to-table heritage, and she had penciled a dotted red line straight through the middle of my asparagus field. She didn't ask. She didn't call. She didn't knock on the farmhouse door. She just added 18 acres of my land to her map and told 96 households it belonged to them now. What she did next is where it gets interesting, and a little heartbreaking, and eventually a lot worse for her than she could have pictured on her worst day. The first tour came through on a Saturday in early May, about the time the spears are running 6 inches a day, and every stalk on the crown is about to pay the rent. I was out on the tractor widening the drainage furrow on row 8, when I heard voices behind me that didn't sound like any worker I'd hired. I cut the engine and turned around, and there were 11 strangers, women mostly, a few kids, one guy in salmon-colored shorts, ambling through row 12 like it was a state park. A little blonde girl was bending down to snap a spear off at the base, and her mother was holding up a phone to film her. A man in a straw hat was stepping across 3 beds at once and leaving deep prints in the soft mulch I'd just raked the night before. And at the head of the line, walking backward and narrating through a battery-powered speaker clipped to her hip, was Maggie Whitlock. She was telling them about Heritage Michigan asparagus and the local farmers who so generously share this land. I climbed down off the tractor calmly. I walked over, and I said, as politely as a man can say it when his blood is simmering, "Folks, this is private property. I need you to step back out to the road." A few of them looked confused. A few of them looked embarrassed. Maggie looked at me like I'd interrupted her wedding toast. She clapped her hands twice and announced, loudly enough that every guest could hear, "Oh, don't worry about Dan. He's one of our local farm partners. We have a shared use agreement." We did not have a shared use agreement. We had never had a conversation that contained the phrase, shared use agreement. But 11 guests heard her say it, and 2 of them laughed and took more pictures. And a woman in a visor said, "Thank you, sir. This is just charming." And they kept walking. The smell of crushed asparagus is a very specific smell. Sharp, green, almost a little like fresh corn. And the whole row reeked of it after they left, the kind of green scent that stays on your hands for an hour. I knelt down and counted 47 broken spears in an 80-foot section. At $6 a pound retail, that morning walk cost me around $90 in produce and an entire afternoon of remulching under a sun hot enough to sting the back of my neck. I called the county sheriff's non-emergency line. The dispatcher was kind and explained that unless I'd posted no trespassing signs at every entry point and given her written notice, this was a civil matter, not a criminal one. She suggested I talk to the HOA board. That was my first mistake, thinking a board existed the way a normal board exists. Turns out, in Harborview, the board was Maggie and 3 women who considered themselves her junior varsity. 2 of them worked at her husband's dental practice, and the 3rd was her bridge partner. Every vote they had ever taken was unanimous, because disagreement in that clubhouse was about as welcome as a horsefly at a wedding. The following week, I drove over to the HOA clubhouse, a brand new barn-style building with those fake-aged wood beams, and I sat in a folding chair while Maggie presided over what she called their community enrichment meeting. I waited my turn. I explained, calmly, that 90% of the crop I sell at farmers markets walks out of the field between April and June, and that every footprint on a young crown can damage the plant for the next 3 seasons. I brought a printout from Michigan State University Extension Services explaining exactly why. Maggie read it, smiled, slid it to the side. Then she explained to the room that my field was part of the viewshed and that the community-facing portions were covered under what she called the neighborhood enjoyment provision. She'd invented that phrase 5 minutes before I walked in. A nice retired woman in the back, Mrs. Albrecht, raised her hand and asked if maybe the tours could route around the asparagus. Maggie said, "We'll discuss it offline, Eleanor," in the same tone you'd use to shush a child. They never discussed it offline. The next Saturday there were 19 tour guests in my rows. The Saturday after that, 27. And so I drove to the hardware store and bought 14 no trespassing signs, 4 of those yellow reflective posts, and 1,000 feet of orange mason twine. I spent a Tuesday evening walking the property line and posting every corner the way state law requires, boot heels sinking into the soft spring soil. When I came back Sunday morning to check, every single sign had been pulled out of the ground and stacked in a neat little pile at the edge of the road. A handwritten note on top, in blue gel pen, read simply, "Removed for aesthetic violation. M.W." My stomach went cold in a very specific way, because that's when I understood she wasn't confused. She knew exactly what she was doing. By the 3rd week of May, the damage was ugly enough that I started keeping a log. I'm an engineer by training. Logs are what I do when other men would throw fists. I bought a cheap spiral notebook at the gas station and wrote down every tour I witnessed. Date, time, estimated head count, photographs, and every line Maggie delivered through her little speaker. I wrote down the make and model of every car parked along my fence line. I wrote down the names I could catch from name tags and Facebook comments. The notebook filled up faster than I expected. I also did something smarter. I called my cousin Jared, who runs a bow hunting supply store outside Muskegon, and I asked him how many trail cameras he could get me in the next 48 hours at the wholesale cost. He said 34. I said send them. When the boxes arrived, I sat at my kitchen table 3 nights in a row, mounting cameras on low cedar stakes at the east end of every pair of rows, aiming them down the lane at chest height, each one triggered by the slightest motion, and synced to a cloud backup I paid $19 a month to maintain. Eli helped me. He was good with the brackets and the SD cards, and he asked, between mouthfuls of his grandmother's banana bread, "Dad, is this like the kind of evidence Mom would have needed for her nursing licensing thing?" Sarah had been a hospital charge nurse. She built binders of documentation, the way other people build scrapbooks. She could tell you the serial number of every IV pump on her floor by memory. I told him yes, it's exactly the kind of evidence Mom would have kept. He nodded like he'd expected the answer. Then, very quietly, he added, "Good. She hated sloppy work." The small laugh that came out of me was the first one I'd managed in about a month. That same week, Maggie escalated. She started mailing me what she called compliance letters. Each one was on cream-colored stationery, with a little embossed anchor at the top, because of course the HOA had a nautical logo in a county 30 minutes from any harbor deep enough to float a pontoon. The letters accused me of violating something called the Harborview Estates Agricultural Aesthetics Standard, which was not a thing that existed anywhere except in her laser printer. She fined me $400 for unkempt rows. She fined me another $250 for inappropriate signage, my no trespassing signs, the same ones she'd pulled out of my own dirt. She fined me another $300 for obstructing community access. By the end of the month, she had mailed me 11 letters and invoiced me for $2,440. I didn't respond to any of them. I filed them all in a green accordion binder, by date, with the envelope still stapled to the letters. Because in Michigan, an HOA has no authority whatsoever over property that is not governed by its recorded deed restrictions, and my farm had never been in her deed, never been in her plat, and never signed into her association. The takeaway most homeowners don't know is simple. An HOA's power ends the instant you step off land that voluntarily joined it. The letters weren't enforcement. They were a paper trail she was building for herself, and she was too proud to realize it would become a paper trail against her. Around that time, Eli started asking questions. One night we were sitting on the back porch watching the fireflies rise out of the tree line, and he said, without looking at me, "Dad, why don't you just yell at her?" I thought about that for a long second. I told him something my father used to say, that a patient man with a good record always beats a loud man with a bad one. Eli chewed that over for a while. Then he said, "I think Mom would have liked that." I put my arm around him. I didn't say anything. Because sometimes, the things your son says are already the whole sentence, and anything you add just makes it smaller. We sat there until the mosquitoes ran us inside, and I fell asleep on the couch with the spiral notebook on my chest, like a man guarding a Bible in a storm. By the first week of June, Maggie had changed tactics. The tours kept coming, but now she started sending vendors. A landscaping crew from 2 towns over pulled up one Wednesday morning in a white box truck, unloaded 3 men with string trimmers, and started cutting down the wildflower border I kept at the east end of the field. The strip I'd planted specifically to bring in pollinators for the asparagus when it flowers in August. One of the men was polite. He showed me the work order. It was on Harborview Estates letterhead, signed by Margaret Whitlock, and it authorized cosmetic maintenance of the community garden border. I walked the man back to his truck and explained, slowly, that the field wasn't community property, that he was being asked to destroy pollinator habitat on private agricultural land, and that if he didn't leave immediately, I was going to call the Oceana County Sheriff and then his company's insurance carrier. He left. He was decent about it. He said, "Sir, I'm sorry, I had no idea. She told me she was the landowner." That sentence rang in my head for the rest of the morning. She told me she was the landowner. 3 days later, she tried it again, this time with a different crew, a bigger truck, and a sign-up sheet the foreman said was for community beautification volunteers. When I stepped out of the barn, the foreman actually flinched because Maggie had described me to him as the difficult old man who might become aggressive. I was 44. I had a coffee mug in my hand. I sent him home too, politely, and I took photographs of the work order, the truck, the license plate, and the printed volunteer list. Then I did something I hadn't done in 20 years. I drove out to see my father's old friend Gordon Lutz, a retired county surveyor who still kept his transit in the garage, and I asked him to walk my property line with me, one stake at a time, for the official record. He said, "Son, I haven't been out that way since your daddy's funeral. I'd be honored." We walked it the next morning at sunrise. Gordon pounded fresh cedar pins at every corner, took elevation readings, and filed a dated sketch with his old firm's seal on it. He refused to charge me. "Your father," he said, "pulled me out of a ditch in 1996. This walk doesn't even come close." Then came the part I hadn't braced for. 2 nights later, Eli walked through the back door with his jaw set too tight for a boy his age. He set his backpack down, opened the fridge, closed it without taking anything, and said, "Dad, a girl at school told me her mom says we're stealing the neighborhood's garden." I set my fork down. I asked him who her mother was. He said the last name and I recognized it. One of Maggie's junior varsity board members, the bridge partner. I asked Eli what he said back. He said, "I told her my mom planted some of those crowns before she died, and my dad's the only one who waters them now." Then he looked at me and said, almost apologetically, "Was that okay to say?" I told him it was exactly okay. I told him it was the whole truth, and the whole truth was going to handle itself in its own time. That night I wrote one more line in the spiral notebook, at the bottom of the page, so I wouldn't forget who she was willing to drag into this. She's sending her lies through the lunchroom now. I underlined it once. I didn't have to underline it twice. The very next Saturday, the 6th weekend in a row, I counted 34 guests on the live feed by 10 in the morning. Maggie had added something new, a fold-out easel at the head of row 1, displaying what she was calling the community heritage map, with my 18 acres shaded in pale green, and the phrase "shared use since founding" printed across the top in a fake-aged typewriter font. I sat at my kitchen table and watched her point at that easel through the camera feed, a small, proud smile on her face. And I realized something that shifted my entire posture. She had moved from trespass to fraud. She was now making public representations about my land to strangers, in writing, with professionally printed signage, for a profit. Tour tickets had gone on sale at $15 a head the previous Tuesday. That wasn't HOA overreach anymore. That was a business built on a lie, and I knew enough law from 2 decades of municipal engineering to understand that once money changes hands on a false statement about real property, you've crossed the line the state takes very personally. That afternoon, Eli and I drove into Hart, the county seat, and I walked into the Register of Deeds office and filed a formal records request. I also filed one at the County Equalization Office, and another at the Planning and Zoning Department. I asked for every document on file relating to Harborview Estates Subdivision, plat number 2019-014, and any easement or right-of-way that touched parcel 064-031-300-014, which is my farm. I paid the copy fees in cash. I smiled at the clerk. I said, "Thank you, ma'am." And I drove home because 3 days later, a manila envelope thicker than a phone book was going to arrive at my mailbox, and the whole shape of the next 6 months was going to change the minute I opened it. Here is what was inside that envelope. In the original plat approved by the county in 2019, there was no easement of any kind across my land. My parcel, which is outside the subdivision, had never been annexed, never been platted into Harborview, never been touched by their boundaries. But buried inside a supplemental filing dated April 2023, 6 weeks before the first tour, was a document titled Petition for Establishment of Community Walking Easement. It was a 2-page petition claiming that the owners of parcel 064-031-300-014 had voluntarily granted a perpetual walking easement across the south half of their land to Harborview Estates, HOA, for the purpose of community recreation and cultural preservation. At the bottom of the second page were 2 signatures. One said Daniel J. Roper. The other said Sarah K. Roper. Sarah had been dead for almost 2 years at the time that petition was filed. I sat there in the kitchen with the spring light coming through the window and the clock on the wall ticking like a slow drum, and I read those signatures 4 times before I let myself believe them. The Daniel signature was not mine. It was close enough to fool a clerk who'd never met me. The R curled the way I used to curl it when I signed my college homework, the same way my name appeared in the Oceana Herald 2 decades ago when I graduated. The Sarah signature was her maiden initial style from 20 years ago, which meant whoever had copied it had pulled from an old public document, most likely the marriage license on file at the same courthouse. The petition had been notarized by a notary whose commission number matched a woman who worked part-time at Harborview Estates Management Company, a niece of Maggie's husband. The stamp was legitimate. The signatures were forged. And the easement, the single document Maggie had been pointing to every Saturday for 3 months, was a fraud from the day it was filed. Forgery of a public record in Michigan is a 14-year felony under MCL 750.248. Using a forged instrument, separately, is another 14-year felony under MCL 750.249. Notarizing a signature the notary didn't actually witness is a felony under the state's notary law. And filing a fraudulent claim to real estate is a violation of the Uniform Real Property Electronic Recording Act. I sat there and made a list, and by the time I'd finished the list, I understood that Maggie Whitlock hadn't just been harassing me. She had committed 4 separate felonies, each of which carried more potential prison time than most homicides in this state. I also understood why she'd been so bold about the tours. She genuinely believed the paperwork protected her. She thought her own forged document was a shield. She didn't realize that every tour she ran under that document was another public act of using a fraudulent instrument, which is its own separate felony every single time. I did not call the sheriff that day. I did not confront her. I did not say one word to anyone outside my own kitchen. Because the thing about evidence is, if you show your hand too early, the other player gets to reshuffle. I wanted every card on the table before she knew the game had changed. I wrote one sentence in my notebook that night, underlined it twice, and closed the cover. Let her keep walking. It was the best sentence I'd written in 3 years, and it was going to do more work than any sentence I ever said out loud. Over the next 4 weeks, I worked 2 different plans at the same time. The first plan was technical. I upgraded every trail camera on the property to high-resolution color at night models, the kind deer hunters use when they want to identify a specific buck across 80 yards of timber. I re-aimed each one to catch faces, not just bodies. I added 2 cellular cameras at the corners of the field, with a live feed straight to my phone. I replaced the cloud backup with a dual redundant service that also wrote to an external hard drive in a locked cabinet in the barn. And from there, every Sunday night, to a second drive I kept at my sister's house in Ludington. I walked the entire perimeter with a handheld GPS unit and marked the property line to within a hand's width, and I matched those coordinates to the recorded survey at the county. I hammered in 46 yellow, no trespassing signs, each one weatherproofed and screwed, not nailed, so they couldn't be pulled loose without leaving evidence on the post. I did not tell Maggie what I was doing. I did not answer her letters. I let her keep sending tours. Every Saturday, I watched the live feed from my barn with a thermos of coffee and a quiet heart, taking timestamps in my notebook like a birdwatcher logging migrations. The second plan was legal. I drove to Muskegon and hired an attorney named Carla Benton, a sharp woman in her 50s who had spent 15 years as an assistant prosecutor before going private. She had one of those offices that smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper, and a framed picture of a prize-winning steer on the wall behind her desk. I walked her through the binder, the notebook, the photographs, the letters, the records request, the forged petition, and Gordon Lutz's fresh survey. She read for 45 minutes without saying a word, only tapping a pencil eraser against the corner of her desk. When she finally looked up, she said, "Daniel, this is the cleanest case of recorded document fraud I've seen in my career. Don't say anything to her. Don't warn her. Don't file a complaint yet. Let me coordinate with the county prosecutor and the state police white-collar unit. When we move all at once." I asked her if the tours should keep happening. She smiled, the kind of small, careful smile prosecutors save for their best cases. She said, "Let me put it this way. Every tour is another felony. Every Saturday she's handing us more evidence. If she stops, we lose nothing. If she doesn't, she builds our case for us." While the legal machinery started to hum in the background, Maggie tried to widen the stage. On a Tuesday afternoon, she walked into the offices of the Oceana Herald with a folder and a practiced smile and pitched them a story about the Harborview Estates Heritage Garden Walk and the difficult local farmer resisting community participation. The reporter she drew, a mild-mannered man named Phil Danner, had known my father for 30 years. He took her folder. He nodded politely. He smiled her out the door. And then he picked up the phone and called me. He said, "Daniel, I just had the strangest visit, and I thought you ought to know what she's claiming." I told him only this: please sit on it for 3 weeks, and I promise you the story you're about to get is a better one than the one she just tried to sell you. He laughed once, a dry, knowing laugh, and said, "I've been waiting for a story to break in this county for a long time. I can wait 3 more weeks." He hung up. He waited. He was a newspaperman from back when newspapermen knew how to let a trap close before they stepped into the frame. 2 days later, Maggie tried the radio station in Hart. The station manager, a woman whose husband farmed blueberries a mile east of me, politely declined. Maggie tried a home and garden blog out of Grand Rapids. The blog manager asked her for a copy of the easement document to verify the claims before posting. Maggie said she'd send it over. She never did, because somewhere in the back of her mind, a small red light had started to blink, and she was smart enough not to put that piece of paper in the hands of anybody who might actually read it carefully. Meanwhile, Eli and I got to work on the thing that mattered most, the field itself. We ran drip lines we'd been meaning to run for 2 summers. We remulched every bed with fresh straw that smelled like hot hay in the sun. We recrowned 4 rows that had been damaged beyond repair from the earlier trampling. I registered the farm for the Michigan Agriculture Environmental Assurance Program, which would qualify us for additional legal protection under the state's Right to Farm Act. And I signed the papers establishing a conservation easement through a West Michigan land trust that would lock the agricultural use of the parcel into the deed forever. The takeaway there is one most farmers don't realize. A conservation easement doesn't just protect the land from development, it also creates a permanent legal record of the allowed uses, which makes any future community trail claim legally impossible. I also called the Oceana County Asparagus Festival Committee, which had been running the annual festival since 1974, and I offered to host a public harvest demonstration on the weekend after Memorial Day as part of the event. The festival director, a gentlewoman named B. Morley, said yes immediately. She also said, "Daniel, I've been hearing things. Is it true the new HOA's been bothering you?" I told her a little. She listened hard. Then she said, "Honey, you're a roper. Half this county's planted with your father's crowns. Whatever you need, you just tell me." I told her what I needed. She started making phone calls that same afternoon. In late June, with the big Saturday garden tour 3 weeks away, Maggie made her biggest play yet. She convened a special HOA meeting and pushed through a resolution authorizing what she called a community stewardship event. A full HOA garden tour, scheduled for the final Saturday of June, routed through my field, co-hosted with a regional magazine that specialized in Lake Michigan lifestyle content, and advertised on social media across 3 counties. The tour was capped at 75 guests. She expected 140 to show up. Her husband ordered a white pop-up tent to position at the head of my field so guests could pose for photographs against the green backdrop. She placed an order for 250 glossy pamphlets, featuring a full-color map of the Harborview Estates Community Garden Walk, with my land proudly highlighted in pale green. She arranged for a food truck. She arranged for parking volunteers with neon vests. She arranged for a mobile pastry vendor to set up at the west end of row 1. She even arranged for a harpist. A harpist. She arranged, without knowing it, the single best evidence capture opportunity a prosecutor had ever been handed. While she was doing that, I was doing something different. I walked into the Oceana County Sheriff's Office with Carla on a Thursday morning and met privately with Under Sheriff Aaron Vogel. I brought the forged petition, the notebook, the letters, the photographs, the cellular camera footage, Gordon's survey, and the case summary Carla had written. He read for 20 minutes. His coffee went cold on the desk. Then he said 3 words. He said, "Who else knows?" We told him, nobody on Maggie's side. He nodded. He called in a captain. The captain called in a state police detective sergeant from the Rockford Post. By the end of the afternoon, I had a scheduled meeting with the Oceana County prosecutor, 2 detectives from the Michigan State Police White Collar Unit, and a representative from the Secretary of State's Notary Enforcement Office. By the end of the week, they had arrest warrants drafted, sealed, and waiting in a locked drawer. Nobody on the HOA side had any idea. Maggie kept posting to the Harborview Estates Facebook page about our biggest community event of the year and ordering more lawn signs. A week before the big tour, Maggie launched one last pressure campaign. She printed 96 door hangers in bright yellow, one for every house in Harborview, titled, "Stand with Your Community, Attend the June Garden Walk." The door hangers accused an uncooperative adjacent landowner of trying to block our rightful heritage access and urged residents to attend in overwhelming numbers to demonstrate community solidarity. Mrs. Albrecht saved one and drove it to my porch the next morning, with her hands shaking. She said, "Daniel, this is disgraceful. Half the people in this subdivision are too polite to say anything, but plenty of us are sick of her." She also said something I filed away carefully. She said, "There's a group text among about 30 of the homeowners. We've been sharing her emails for months. If you ever want to see what she's really been saying about you, I can forward the whole thread." I thanked her. I asked her to hold on to it for a little longer. 3 weeks, I said, then send it to my attorney all at once. She nodded, slid the door hanger into her purse and said, "You know, Daniel, your wife used to bring me soup when my hip was out. I remember her every time I walk past your field." I thanked her again. I didn't trust my voice for much more than that. She tried one more thing before the tour. On the Wednesday before the big Saturday, she drove out to my farmhouse in her white Lincoln Navigator, parked halfway up my gravel drive, and stepped out in a pale peach blazer that looked brand new. Eli was on the porch shelling peas into a metal bowl. I was fixing the hinge on the barn door. She walked right up like we were old friends and said, "Daniel, I wanted to come by personally to make sure we're all on the same page about Saturday. This is going to be a beautiful event. I'd hate for there to be any misunderstandings." I set the hinge down. I wiped my hands on a rag. I said, "Ma'am, we're on the same page." She smiled like she'd won. She said, "Wonderful. I'll see you at 8:30. Please wear something clean." She got back in her Navigator and drove away, gravel popping under her tires like small applause. Eli looked up from his peas and said, quietly, "Dad, is Saturday the day?" I said, "Saturday's the day." He went back to the peas. The metal bowl filled up steady and bright in the afternoon sun. We didn't say another word about it. Some silences in this house were older than he was, and he'd learned, the way any good farmer's son learns, that the right kind of quiet is its own form of strength. That Friday night, I walked the field one last time. The sun was falling behind the tree line, and the rows smelled like warm straw and cold dirt, and a pair of sandhill cranes lifted off the back pasture like prehistoric gliders, their long calls bending through the air. I stood at the top of row 1, and I thought about Sarah. I thought about her hands, and the way she'd fold towels in thirds instead of halves, and the way she'd walk this field with me barefoot in the early mornings when the dew was still up and the first crickets hadn't gone to sleep yet. I thought about the forged signature that had her name on it, and how a stranger in a laser-printed blouse had dared to press a pen in her place. And I said, out loud, to nobody, "I'm going to finish this clean, honey, for you." Then I went inside, ate dinner with my son, and slept better than I had in 2 months. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of warm blue June sky that makes everything feel like a painting. At 8:15, cars started rolling into the gravel turnaround Maggie had commandeered at the south end of the field. By 8:45, there were 131 guests milling around the pop-up tent with coffee cups and pastry boxes, and the harpist, a real live harpist, was already playing something soft and folky near the end of row 1. By 9 o'clock, Maggie had taken her place at the head of the rows, with her battery-powered speaker clipped to her hip, and a handheld microphone she'd rented for the occasion. She wore a pale yellow linen dress. She'd had her hair blown out. She wore gold earrings the size of postage stamps. She looked, for the first time, like she was running for office. She raised the microphone and welcomed everyone, in her loudest and most practiced tone, to the Harborview Estates Community Garden Walk, a heritage experience across 18 acres of shared community land. Every trail camera on the property was already running. 2 deputies were parked in unmarked vehicles behind the tree line. A Michigan State Police white-collar detective sat in an SUV with 2 assistants from the prosecutor's office. A camera crew from the local NBC affiliate was set up inside the barn with B. Morley from the festival committee. And at the edge of the gravel lot, County Commissioner James Halverson, my father's old friend, invited quietly by B the Tuesday before, stood in a tan jacket pretending to be there as a curious neighbor. She began with a little speech from a folded card in her palm. She thanked the magazine. She thanked her husband. She thanked the HOA board by name. She gestured at the field behind her and described it as our community's beating green heart. A few guests clapped politely. A little boy in a bow tie asked his mother if there would be ice cream. Behind the harpist, 3 generations of a Muskegon family posed for a photograph with my rose as a backdrop. The entire scene looked, for a strange and unsettling minute, like a magazine spread. Tent snapping softly in the breeze, white tablecloths, silver coffee urns catching the morning light, a distant line of goldfinches moving across the south fence, and all of it, every frame of it, was being recorded by 34 trail cameras, 2 cellular cameras, a NBC affiliate camera in the barn, a state police body camera on the undersheriff's chest, and a cell phone in my own shirt pocket. I have never in my life watched a woman build her own trap with so much loving attention. Maggie led the guests straight into row 1. She walked backward. She narrated as she went, her voice echoing out of the little speaker across the warm morning air. She told the tour, on a hot microphone being recorded from 4 directions, that the field was a permanent shared easement granted to the Roper family as part of our neighborhood heritage partnership. At that sentence, Carla Benton, standing 30 feet away with the state police detective, whispered, "There it is, recorded." Publicly, the deputies started walking. Maggie saw them coming and smiled like she was about to be photographed for a magazine cover. The undersheriff stepped in front of her and said, clearly, "Margaret Whitlock, we have a warrant for your arrest on 4 counts of forgery of a public record, 1 count of uttering and publishing, and 1 count of fraud relating to real property." She laughed, out loud, into her microphone. Every guest heard it. Her husband, standing under the pop-up tent, dropped his coffee cup on his own shoe. The harpist stopped mid-phrase, and the note hung in the air like a small question. Carla stepped forward and, in the calmest voice I've ever heard a woman use, recited the case number, the warrant number, and the date the forged petition had been filed. Maggie's face changed the exact shade of pale you only see on people who have suddenly realized the room is not the one they thought they were in. That's when I stepped out from beside the barn. I had a clean shirt on. I had my coffee in my left hand. I lifted the microphone that B had clipped quietly to my collar, and I addressed the crowd, because the crowd deserved the truth. I said, "Folks, I'm Dan Roper. This is my farm. It's been my family's farm since 1978. There is no easement across this property. There never was. The document Mrs. Whitlock has been pointing to contains a signature from my wife, Sarah, who passed away in 2023. That signature is a forgery. I'm sorry you were brought here under false pretenses. But every one of you is welcome to stay as my guest. Pick your own asparagus, and I'll send each of you home with a pound of it for free." A long, stunned silence. Then a woman in the back clapped once. Then another. Then the whole crowd. The NBC camera caught all of it. Mrs. Albrecht wiped her eyes with the corner of her sleeve. Maggie was walked out in handcuffs past her own pop-up tent, while her husband stared at his shoes. She didn't say a word. She had finally run out of them. Commissioner Halverson watched it all with his hands in his pockets, and when Maggie went past him, he just tipped his chin, the way farmers do when the weather finally breaks. The trial moved quickly for a trial. Maggie pleaded guilty 9 weeks later to 2 felony counts, forgery of a public record and uttering and publishing, in exchange for the dismissal of the other charges. The notary at the management company lost her commission and paid a restitution judgment. Maggie was sentenced to a year in county jail with work release, 3 years of probation, $16,000 in restitution to me, and a court-ordered public apology printed in the Oceana Herald. The HOA dissolved the community garden walk in an emergency meeting the Tuesday after her arrest. Mrs. Albrecht became the new interim president. Her first act was to drive out to my farmhouse with a store-bought apple pie and tell me, "Daniel, on behalf of the neighborhood that never wanted any of this, I am so sorry." I told her she didn't need to be. We sat on the porch and ate 2 slices each, and Eli came out with a jar of cold milk, and none of us said much, because sometimes the best kind of apology is just somebody finally being willing to sit in the quiet next to you. The days after the arrest were strange, in a quiet, healing way. Neighbors I'd never met walked up the gravel drive with covered dishes, the way people in Oceana County used to walk food over after a funeral. A retired teacher from 2 streets inside Harborview brought a hot dish with crushed potato chips on top and said simply, "We should have spoken up sooner. I'm sorry we didn't." A man whose wife had taken one of Maggie's first tours wrote me a 2-page letter apologizing for not realizing what he'd been walking through. Phil Danner ran his 3-week delayed story on the front page of the Sunday Herald. A calm, careful, beautifully reported piece that quoted Gordon Lutz, Mrs. Albrecht, and Commissioner Halverson, and included a photograph of me and Eli standing at the south end of row 1, with the sun rising behind us. The headline read simply, "The Quiet Man and the Forged Signature." Phil sent me a framed copy of the front page 3 days after it ran. It hangs now in my kitchen, next to the one photograph I have of Sarah in the field, her hair up, her hands in the soil. That August, with B. Morley's help, we turned the whole mess into something better. We launched the Sarah Roper Memorial Scholarship through the Oceana County Asparagus Festival, a $2,000 annual award for a local high school senior going into agriculture or nursing, the two fields Sarah loved most. 41 people donated in the first month. Mrs. Albrecht donated twice. Commissioner Halverson wrote a personal check and didn't tell anyone. The local magazine that had been scheduled to cover the garden tour ran a 6-page feature instead on the Roper family's 50-year history in Oceana County asparagus farming, and requests for farm tours, real tours, booked tours, price tours with liability waivers and clean walking lanes started coming in from all over West Michigan. Eli and I built a small welcome stand at the south end of the field that October. Stained cedar, tin roof. We put Sarah's name on a brass plaque above the door. The first visitor who read that plaque was a 14-year-old girl from Shelby who wanted to be a nurse. Eli watched her read it, and after she left, he came and stood next to me and said, "Dad, Mom would have liked this one." I said, "Yeah, buddy, she really would have." And the late afternoon light went slanting down the rows the way it used to when Sarah was still here. Clean and long and gold. The scholarship awarded its first recipient in May, a senior from Shelby High School named Jenna Ortiz, valedictorian of her class, headed to Grand Valley State for a nursing degree, and already accepted into their honors program. Eli handed her the envelope himself at the festival banquet. He'd rehearsed the sentence in the mirror 3 nights in a row. He said, "My mom was a charge nurse for 14 years. She would have wanted you to have this." Jenna's mother cried. My aunt cried. I didn't cry, but only because I'd done most of that crying the night before, alone at the kitchen table, looking at the photograph of Sarah in the field. The whole room clapped for a long time. Afterward, Jenna sent Eli a handwritten note, on real stationery, thanking him. He taped it inside the cover of his math notebook. It's still there. The trail cameras are still up. They don't need to be anymore. But I leave them there anyway, mounted on the cedar stakes at the east end of each pair of rows, red eyes blinking low in the dark. Because sometimes a quiet man with a clean record beats a loud woman with a forged one. And sometimes the best kind of justice is the kind that arrives slowly, in a good suit, with a warrant in its hand, while the villain is too busy performing to notice the ground has shifted under her feet.
That's the reason this story lands the way it does. And it's not just because she got aggressive in front of her own tour. It's because Daniel didn't flinch. He didn't scream, didn't swing, didn't lower himself to her level for a single minute. He did what quiet men have always done best. He kept recourse, he kept receipt. He gave his word to the wife he lost. Maggie thought fake authorities was the same as real authority. She thought a brochure and a microphone made the thing true. And when you force a dead woman's signature to steal a living man's field, you don't get to call that community leadership. You get to call it the mistake that ends you. The real lesson here is simple. Paper beats panic. Patience beats performance. And a man who still talks to his late wife while he walks his rounds is the man you do not want to be on the wrong side of. If you ever had an HOA try to revise the lines around your own land, tell me your story in the comments. I read every single one. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Because next week, we're heading to North Carolina, where an HOA president filed a federal complaint against a disabled veteran ramp, and what the VA sent back broke her entire ward in half.